Kia ora and welcome to Talking Dairy. I'm your host, Jac McGowan from DairyNZ. It's great to have you with us. Today we're talking about new research that shows key differences in how high-profit farms are also achieving lower emissions intensity. Greenhouse gas emissions is a topic that's getting a lot more attention, and we know it can raise plenty of questions. We're here to share what we're learning using real farm data about how emissions and profitability connect and where the opportunities might be in a farm system. This is part of a major piece of work we've been involved in called the Emissions and Profitability Project. It's a joint effort between DairyNZ, DairyBase, Fonterra and LIC. Together we've looked at data from around 8,000 farms to better understand how to support profitable, sustainable dairy farming in a way that works for farmers and meets the changing expectations from customers and markets. So, why now? What's driving this? Some milk processors in New Zealand, including Fonterra, are starting to offer incentives for milk that's produced with lower emissions intensity. That's the amount of greenhouse gas produced per kilogram of milk solids. This is the number that international customers are increasingly looking at when deciding who to buy dairy from. But the reality is, pasture-based systems like ours are complex and dynamic. There's no one-size-fits-all answer, and if you push one lever too hard, it can throw others out of balance. That's why this project takes a balanced approach, looking at emissions alongside profit, nitrogen surplus and other indicators to help paint a clearer picture of what's working on farm and where the opportunities lie. To unpack all of this, I'm joined today by Mark Neal, Head of Data Science and Modelling at DairyNZ, who led the technical analysis, and Louise Cook, Environmental Program Manager from the On-Farm Excellence team at Fonterra, who brings a practical view from both farm and market perspectives. We'll talk through what the data shows, what it means for your farm, and how this new research highlights the homegrown advantage, showing key differences in how high-profit farms are also achieving lower emissions intensity. Let's get into it. Tēnā korua, Mark and Louise, it's great to have you both here. To kick things off, can you each give us a quick introduction about who you are and your role? We'll start with you, Louise.
Kia ora, I'm Louise Cook. I'm one of the program managers in the On-Farm Excellence Environment team. I've had 20 odd years now in this beautiful dairy industry here in New Zealand, from one end of the country to the other. And at the moment, I spend my time working on data, insights, information and strategies for farmers in relation to some of those environmental challenges that are in front of us, most notably emissions.
And how about you, Mark?
Yeah, I'm Mark Neal. I'm the Head of Data Science and Modelling at DairyNZ, which means work with the larger data that we have to work with and using modern analytical and statistical techniques. Got a strong background in farm systems and economics, been at DairyNZ for over a decade now, and prior to that was a farming background and involved in a number of international farms as well.
Thank you very much. Now, Mark, this project analysed data from 8,000 farms. That's a lot of farms, as you said. What were you aiming to uncover and how does it connect with the challenges farmers are facing today?
So, yeah, farmers are always making decisions. They're working in a complex farm system and there's multiple goals that they might have. Been specific to this study, profitability, emissions intensity per unit of product, gross emissions from a national target perspective, and factors that can affect water quality like purchased nitrogen surplus. So, it's complex. They've got these multiple goals. And so our aim was to use all the available data from ourselves and with Fonterra so that we could really understand what's happening on farm and what does that mean for what are some more useful pathways going forwards.
Okay. And Louise, why was this work important for Fonterra to be part of?
So we've got a really clear direction of travel from our customers and our strategy kind of aligns to that in terms of emissions intensity. But it's also fair to say that as we've come out with these targets, now with incentives, there's been one or two responses from farmers and rural professionals about whether focusing on emissions intensity is like trading off emissions against profitability or against water quality. And we kind of wanted to be able to dispel the myths. Because when we looked at our internal data, looking at emissions intensity, when we focused on just the on-farm activities, so none of the land-based emissions, just the on-farm activities, there was a pretty clear indication that emissions-efficient farm were actually just efficient across the board. And we also knew that as we've transitioned beyond biological emissions on the dairy farm, to the life cycle analysis data that we have from Ag Research's Ag LCA, we would occasionally end up with a slightly different conclusion in regards to emissions compared to some of our other industry analysis. So what became really imperative was that we linked our data set with some other really rich industry data sets like DairyNZ's DairyBase and LIC's data, so that at the end of it we'd have some outcomes based on data that was able to give us some really consistent advice and guidance for farmers to use. And so most pressing for us at Fonterra was to understand that missing piece of the puzzle with regards to farmer profitability when thinking about reducing the emissions intensity.
And what are you hearing from farmers about that balancing act between profitability and sustainability?
It's a really interesting trade-off. We know that we've got farmers absolutely caring about the environmental imperatives, and we know we've got people that are absolutely trying to make sure that they have a viable, sustainable business from a profitability point of view as well. And so what we hoped we'd get out of the study was that we'd find absolutely some pathways that were a little bit dangerous, sort of the black diamond runs on the ski slopes. We figured we were going to find those, and that's sort of the pathway that we said to people, high risk, potentially high reward. But we were hoping that there'd be some common themes and trends and critical KPIs and tactics on farm that would be a safe journey for people to proceed down. So you can run as fast as you like. You know the road ahead is safe. You can actually proceed, which I think is a really important piece of the puzzle because it's felt like you've had this trade-off. And I don't think it has to be. It certainly doesn't always have to be. And one of the things I've learned from this project, which Mark's going to talk about, I'm sure, is that we absolutely found that there are people who are living the triple bottom line and it's looking awesome. And so I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, really encouraging. Thank you, Louise. Mark, one of the big headlines from the data was that high profit can be generated in systems with either high or low emissions intensity. Can you break that down for us?
Yeah, so a lot of people probably would have had some thoughts about which way this was going to go, that, you know, the high profitable farms were more often than not low emissions intensity, or some people would have thought the alternative, they're more often high emissions intensity. And the reality is, looking at the data, is that neither of those were true. We found high profit farms with both low intensity and high emissions intensity, and that means that there's an opportunity to understand what are the other variables that are actually explaining the difference between those high profit farms. And so what guidance could we provide around what might be more useful ways to look at your pathway forwards?
So if profit isn't tied directly to emissions intensity, what is it that separates the farms that are both profitable and low emissions intensity?
Yeah, so we saw the farms that were profitable with low emissions intensity had an emphasis on homegrown feed, and where they were using imported supplement, they tended to use less of those feeds that had a high footprint. So feeds where they've been, come from overseas, or they've got a land use change component, tend to have a higher footprint. And so that's things like palm kernel or soybean meal. So farms that tended to limit the use of those and focus on homegrown feed tended to be more often than not in that high profit, low emissions intensity group.
Okay, so I understand why supplement with embedded emissions obviously increases your emissions intensity, but why is homegrown feed such a key factor in driving both profitability and lower emissions intensity?
Yeah, so this goes back to work from many years where we've clearly seen the link between homegrown feed and profitability, but the homegrown feed, where you are limiting your use of machinery and you're increasing your direct grazing, that means that feed can be very, very efficient and it can be very high quality when it's managed correctly.
So a cheap to produce feed with low emissions intensity in it.
Yeah, that's correct.
Mark, as you increased homegrown feed per cow, what else did you see in factors like water quality or nitrogen footprint?
We saw, as we talked about, that the emissions intensity came down. We did see that the purchased nitrogen surplus also came down, which is helpful from a water quality perspective. What was also interesting is that the farms that were increasing that feed eaten per cow, because they tended to use that homegrown feed to reduce their requirement for supplement, is that the total emissions did not increase as much as you might have expected. So we were seeing basically more homegrown feed eaten per cow gave us good gains in purchased nitrogen surplus, good gains in emissions intensity at minimal effect on the overall total emissions. And just for clarity, when we're talking total emissions, we're talking total biological emissions.
Okay. And Louise, as Mark said, the data showed that using less supplements with high embedded emissions can shift the dial. What are some of the conversations you're having with farmers around this and the other findings?
So I think the supplements piece has been really interesting, and there's a really practical element we need to apply to this. But people aren't using supplement for the fun of it. They're using it to support our feed deficits, whether genuine or sometimes I think we create some of our own feed deficits. But people are using supplements to fill feed deficits. Everyone tries their hardest to make sure they're doing that profitably. And so it's a really challenging thing to suggest to people, hey, do you realise that your emissions footprint's really challenged by perhaps the type of supplement, or sometimes it's the timing and volume? Because one of the things that was most fascinating for me in the data is whilst we saw that like the impact of supplements and emissions is quite strong, there were two pieces at play. The people who had the highest profit and low emissions category, they were using both less total supplement, so there was less supplement coming into those farms, but they weren't sacrificing milk production because of that, either per cow or per hectare. So they were really efficient with the feed they chose to use from a feed budget point of view. And then secondarily, generally, we found that to be low emissions, they were using those feeds with those lower footprint categories. And like palm kernel does get a bit of a hard time from an emissions point of view. And we can't shy away from the fact that when we talk life cycle analysis, we talk the full embedded emissions suite. There's some feeds that come into our farm system, like the Horton veggie waste out of New Zealand canning processes, that's got a footprint that's equivalent to, it's like luggage it brings with us. You bring in a ton of feed and it brings its luggage. If you bring in that waste, you're kind of bringing in luggage that's the size of a little wallet versus some of the other feeds that's like dragging a caravan in with you. So it's the same amount of feed, but the amount of embedded emissions that come along as luggage is significantly different. So palm kernel gets knocked around a little bit, but we know that it's a really cost-effective supplement for a lot of our farmers that's supporting quite a bit of productivity. So there's a real balance there in finding the right pathway through. But like I say, there were two pieces to this homegrown feed stuff, right? One was they were still harvesting more homegrown feed on these farms, and I think we can't shy away from the fact that that's the most fundamental principle. But then they were using less supplement as well and still maintaining the production. So the embedded emissions piece is one piece of the puzzle. The second one is let's make sure if you're buying feed into your system that it is getting converted through to additional milk, that there is no pasture substitution going on, that we're really driving profit out of that feed, whatever that supplement footprint, because it might still on budget be the most cost-effective feed to use, but it's making sure it really, really pays for itself. And I think sometimes it's a little bit easy to perhaps lose sight of that and not do that strategic analysis. So hopefully that's something that comes off of this work. Like I say, it's take that step back, make sure that you've got the cost benefit done on what works for your business. And then we would love to say encourage and support our farmers finding cost-effective options that are those kind of lower footprint feeds. So getting into those good farm-grown forages, the footprint is significantly different, and we know that they're a great alternative for cows. They're great for our New Zealand brand in terms of our farm-grown feed, so those options to bring those in. But we do recognise people have to make the right decision for their business with all things considered, but it is taking a step back and kind of going, palm kernel is super easy, but if we thought about it 12 months in advance, is there a partial shift or a slight substitution that sits within the business? So this is about farmers making the right decision for their business based on all of the facts, the information, their values, how they choose to run their business, no question. But yeah, absolutely, we know that the ambition we have in New Zealand to maintain our position at the front end of industry on an emissions intensity point of view, feed type has an impact here and we can't avoid that.
Okay, thank you. Back to you, Mark. You mentioned regional differences. Tell us about the consistency. Did it differ between regions, and was it more specific to certain farm systems?
So the regions where we have the largest volume of data were the ones we focused on, being Waikato and Canterbury. We did look at some of the other regions just to check for consistency, and broadly we do see consistency. But just between the Waikato and Canterbury, some of the differences were that in Canterbury, while the stocking rate was similar for our high profit, low and high emissions intensity farms, in Waikato the stocking rate was slightly lower. We did see that the purchased nitrogen surplus was lower as well with those high profit, low emissions intensity farms. So they're using nitrogen very efficiently. So in Canterbury it was 14% lower, and in Waikato it was 40% lower. So quite substantial.
Thank you. Okay, Louise, this all sounds good in theory, but as a farmer, where do I start? What tools, support or advice are out there now to help farmers spot their opportunities?
Man, where to start is such an important question. And I think the first bit is to be really clear on where your business stands compared to some peers. And it's not a competition, like there's no winners and losers here.
Everything's a competition.
But the world kind of evolves around us, and it's important to keep tabs on how your business is performing. So like immersing yourself and your business in benchmarking opportunities is just critical. So this isn't about figuring out what's wrong. So we don't want to benchmark and go, oh, there's a better than me. We want to go, you are where you are. This is about getting excited about what's next for your business. So let's frame up what's next. So whether you're benchmarking on the physical side of things, it uses like the Fonterra Farm Insights report that we have for our suppliers, or whether you're using the likes of DairyNZ's DairyBase for your physical and financial analysis, whatever way you get that yardstick to measure yourself against, talk about the outcomes with those key advice points in your business. So whether that's other farmers, family, consultants, bankers, accountants, whoever it might be. I mean, we've also got some internal services that we're offering for our suppliers now. If you want that first conversation to go through your data to understand how the numbers came together and how it compares against other people, and talk with our trained and talented team about those first steps so that you can then step off of that platform and connect to those people that can help you follow it right through. I think that's a great place for our farmers to start, but I'll ask Mark to give you some of the other, the lowdown on some of the other DairyNZ initiatives that are sitting out there as well, because there are so many people in industry that want to see our farmers succeed and progress, and it really is a take ownership, reach out, be brave, be confident. It's the strongest thing you'll ever do for your business.
Yeah, so DairyBase, as Louise mentioned, is a great resource to really understand where you're sitting compared to some of your relevant farming peers. And we'd certainly encourage people to take up that opportunity. In terms of your pasture potential, where are you at compared to where you could be? Fonterra farmers will have some of that data on the front of their insights report, or DairyNZ on our website. If you Google pasture potential tool, you can go to a map where you can sort of see what are farmers in your area doing, have a look at that comparison and see, are you at the top already, or have you got some opportunities to improve?
Okay. And what's coming next, Mark? What future work or tools might help farmers make even more confident decisions when it comes to profit and emissions?
So we're going to work on a next phase of this piece of work. So with some of the data at the moment, we use live weight defaults for breeds. And we think we can take advantage of what we know about the genetics and different farm systems, that we could provide a better estimate of what a farm's live weight would be, and that'll help improve the accuracy of our calculations. We also think there's some modern statistical techniques that can do a better job of helping us pull apart, what are the opportunities in a region rather than just describe the differences in the region. So that's giving you more confidence that, making this decision would lead to this particular outcome. More widely, we've got a lot of work that DairyNZ's doing in this space. We've got a 4-year project in collaboration with Ireland called Emissions for Pasture, where we're aiming to understand the methane emissions from dairy cows in pasture-based systems. And that project will give us better estimates for, at different times of year, what are the emissions per kilogram of dry matter. The more general research DairyNZ's taking is around the Less Methane project, where we've got several solutions that we're working on to understand how they fit in New Zealand dairy farm systems, or how they could fit to help us reduce methane. And so there's a project there. It's on the website. More information, dairynz.co.nz/less-methane.
Thank you for your time today, Mark and Louise. It's been a really insightful conversation. What's clear is this: there's no one-size-fits-all answer, but the data does show that some of our most profitable farms with lower emissions intensity have a few key things in common, especially when it comes to feed choices and running efficient systems. And that's good news. It means there are real practical opportunities to have a high-profit farm and low emissions intensity using tools and knowledge we already have here at home. The 4 main takeaways from this study were were know your numbers. Understanding your current system is the first step to spotting the next opportunity. Tools like DairyBase can help with that. Second was to optimise cow performance, focusing on steady improvements in things like reproduction, calving spread, herd structure and body condition makes a difference over time. Thirdly, grow and use more homegrown feed. Lifting the quality and quantity of what's already on farm helps drive profit and lower emissions intensity. And finally, use imported feed efficiently, making sure it adds real value to the system and doesn't create waste or cost. If you want to go deeper into any of those areas, there are great resources available. We'll link to some in the show notes. And if you're keen to explore the full research findings, head to dairynz.co.nz/emissions-profit. You'll find summaries, the full report, and a webinar you can watch in your own time. Thanks for tuning in to Talking Dairy. We'll catch you next time. Mā te wā. Thanks for tuning into this episode of Talking Dairy. Make sure to hit follow so you can keep up to date with our latest episodes. You can also keep up with DairyNZ News on Facebook, Instagram and LinkedIn, or go to our website and sign up for our fortnightly DairyNZ News emails. As always, if you have any feedback on this podcast or have some ideas for future topics or guests to have on the show, please email us at talkingdairy@dairynz.co.nz. Mā te wā, Mōri ora, catch you next time.